I want to thank you all for coming here on this Monday/Tuesday to this very first webinar of the new Research Council webinar series. And we've decided to kick this off with the participation and the organization by two of our RCs. And I'm going to begin sharing. Actually, I have a PowerPoint that will help us to do this. Um, the very first one that we wanted to do today is about dealing with these rather broad questions of our planet and us as we exist on this planet. And we're going to talk today with a series of presentation and discussions by the people who are on my next screen, if I can get there. Um, oops. Okay. Now, here we go. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the program that we have for today is going to start off with Deborah Davidson, who's going to set the stage with us for us with some words about contending with hope and despair in the Anthropocene. We're going to move on to Stuart Lockie, who's going to cultivate hope through landscape restoration. Then I will join in finding hope in territorial innovations. And then we're going to have Joe Lindsay and Atakan Büyük, who are going to discuss all of everything that's been said up to that point, and also prepare a bit of the floor for discussion. So we've organized this that we're going to take we have a 2-hour session today, and we're going to take about an hour and a half for the different presentations and remarks, and leaving half an hour at the end so that we can get some engagement from the floor. So I'm going to pass the mic to Deborah Davidson, and we're going to let each of us present ourselves, and I'm going to provide kind of the official bios in the chat for everyone. So go ahead, Deborah. Deborah, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much. And hello, everybody. I'm just so excited to be sharing this first seminar with each of you and on a topic that I really hold very close to my heart. And as it happens, I'm going to be talking a little bit about our hearts today. I've been asked to set the stage for today's webinar topic, and I'm going to do so by talking about an aspect of our daily lives, of our communities, of our politics that we all know about intimately, and yet all too often we overlook it in our academic inquiries, and that's our emotions, emotionality. I dig much deeper into some of the themes I'll be discussing in my new book for those interested, but today I've been given 10 minutes, so I'm going to dive in as soon as I figure out how to forward my screens. All right. So for sociologists, honestly, the option to ignore emotionality is just no longer justifiable. I mean, this is true for all areas of inquiry, but the relevance of emotions, things like fear, anxiety, anger, hope, guilt, empathy, has been rendered crystal clear as the contours of the climate emergency present themselves to us, and how we respond or do not respond to this emergency. So we tend to think very highly of our intellectual capacities. And this explains, I think, in part our lack of attention to emotions in many fields of social science. René Descartes, who coined the phrase that you see in front of you, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, certainly thought very highly of cognition. This was, of course, as you know, the inspiration for Rodin's sculpture, The Thinker, possibly one of the most famous, or at least most well-known sculptures in the world. But the Academy has come a long way in our treatment of emotions in recent decades, not just in the neurosciences, but in sociology as well. And what the neurosciences tell us actually is that Descartes had it kind of backwards. So rather than I think, therefore I am, it would be more accurate to say I feel, in other words, I am, therefore I think. Our emotions basically enable us to do the work of mattering by drawing our attention to the things that matter. in the midst of a world that's just way too complex and information rich to grasp in its entirety. So those stimuli can manifest in many different ways, depending on who we are, depending on our intersectional positionalities. They might represent immediate personal threats or opportunities. Let's say a bear on a hiking trail, or a new job posting that you just came across in your inbox. But our emotional attention is also drawn to things that matter to us according to our values, like justice, and according to our life experiences, such as hearing about a wildfire ripped through a place that holds childhood memories for us. And also according to our learned predispositions, like people who are inclined to express fear and distrust of people with authority, like, say, the police. So our complex emotional palettes can feel sometimes like a whole lot of baggage some days, but without it, we absolutely would not survive, much less be capable of making hard decisions. Now, sociologists have played a particular role in expanding our understanding of emotions by drawing attention to their social and contextual character. So connecting them to things like personal histories, but also identities, cultural prescriptions. And all of this means that our emotions can be manipulated. So advertisers, of course, know this all too well. But it's not just advertisers, which we also know too well. So the fact that our emotions can be manipulated also means that they can be weaponized. So they could be weaponized, for example, to shape women's identities, their expectations and practices in a manner that conforms to patriarchy. Colonialism is one of the most important social structures that has enabled ecological and climate violence, and this operates at the emotional level too. So colonialism cannot persist without the nurturing of a legitimating ideology that serves basically to sever our emotional attachments to land and to place, and also to each other. And those efforts to cultivate that ideology are more blatant today than ever before. Elon Musk, who feels perfectly entitled to say the inside voice out loud, said in a recent interview with Joe Rogan that the fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. Now, even though Elon Musk seems to be very current, Musk is only putting words to a very, very old colonial project, telling us only to care for ourselves, that collective gains are achieved when everyone pursues our own selfish desires. And these narratives, also including those that support things like the taming of the wilderness, that support white supremacy, and that basically tell us that our first priority should be self-preservation rather than community building, all serve colonialism remarkably well. But these are not narratives that solely operate at the cognitive level, telling us what to think. They also tell us what to feel. They tell us when to feel proud and when to feel ashamed. They tell us to stifle our inherent capacity to express empathy towards others and empathy towards the land. And they also drain our efficacy, our sense of empowerment, particularly when we face monumental crises for which such colonial ideologies offer us no way forward. So what are we left with? We're left with hopelessness and despair, and we're encouraged to feel powerless in the face of the climate emergency. Of course, this outcome also serves that colonial project very well, since it discourages resistance. So how do we turn the corner here? How do we facilitate the resistance that is required to meet this moment? How do we stop further destruction and learn to live on a new planet? How do we come to a place where we can envision a future that is worth moving forward? Well, for sure, we need to acquire and share information about the climate emergency, about the sources of emissions, about the impacts, and about the efforts to obstruct progressive climate policy. But more than anything right now, I think we need to fight this despair. We must not let the Elon Musks of the world tell us not to care about the land and each other and to tell us to give up. This means that we need to insist upon empathy and hope. How do we do this? It sounds impossible because emotions are not decided upon. We can't just turn them on and off at will. But we do know how emotions are cultivated, and the way they're cultivated does give us some agency here. Emotions are embodied. And so, as we know, our affective responses to the world around us are felt in our bodies. But this also means that the reverse is true. We can affect our emotions with our bodies. And this is where intentionality comes in. Our emotions change through our intentionally pursuing certain embodied practices. So you're feeling depressed, you go to the gym, go for a run, go for a walk in nature, and your mood can change. We've all experienced this. You feel anger toward your partner, give them a hug. Your emotions will immediately begin to change. This might not resolve the issues that created the conflict, but it cultivates a different emotion, compassion, and that also creates a cognitive opening for seeking resolution to those conflicts. So we all have the inherited capacity for empathy and for hope, and we do not have to let the power elite take those emotions from us. I recently had the privilege of visiting the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, which the visit in and of itself was a deeply moving experience. But one thing that really struck me while viewing all of this archived footage of anti-apartheid protesters in the streets of Soweto was how they protested, through singing and dancing. So despite the atrocities that they had been experiencing, seeing their loved ones taken away, beaten, and killed, they showed up on the streets to raise their voices in song and to dance together. What better way to show your resistance, to show the apartheid state that they will not win your hearts and minds, but also by singing and dancing together, these protesters cultivate hope together. So hope is a choice. We can succumb to despair, or we can insist upon hope. And we do that through rebuilding our relationships with and through expressions of empathy toward each other and the land through our embodied practices. And our next two presenters, I think, offer two great examples of projects that do just this. So thanks for listening. And I'm going to turn things over to Stuart Lockie to take it up where I'm leaving off here.
Thank you, Deborah. Good morning, colleagues. I'm coming to you this morning from the unceded lands of the Irukandji people in far north Queensland, Australia. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging Irukandji's continuing custodianship of this landscape and these communities. I'd like to acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the work that we continue to do with Irukandji people in my institute at James Cook University. Now, good morning, everybody, or afternoon or evening. Thank you for joining us, especially those who are joining from unfriendly time zones. It's an honour to have you with us. Thank you, Deborah, for that really lovely segue into the things that I and Alison want to talk with you. It would be trite of me to suggest that landscape restoration is the answer to the climate crisis, or the answer to despondency, despair, and doomism. But it is, I would say, one answer. Alison has a hand up.
Yes, because we can see your notes, so it's not in presentation mode, actually.
It's not in presentation mode.
No.
Now is it in presentation mode?
There it is. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Now you won't know how far I deviate from my notes, and you can go back to thinking that I'm completely disorganized, rather than someone who pours hours into thinking about things and then abandons them usually in the first few minutes. Now, by way of context, because in general, I think I'm not a very interesting person, but I think personal context place and biography are quite important in relation to this particular topic. So for the last decade and a bit, I've been based in far north Queensland, just north of Cairns, which many of you will know as a tourism mecca and jump-off spot to visit the Great Barrier Reef. So the Great Barrier Reef is, of course, the world's largest and most well-known coral reef system. And it's become an iconic ecosystem in the struggle for global climate change. You're probably less likely to be aware that this is also the wet tropics bioregion. We're surrounded by the wet tropics World Heritage Area. The wet tropics of Queensland cover about 2 million hectares. Half of that, roughly speaking, is in protected area. The balance is mostly used for agriculture. Now, the wet tropics, if we compare them in scale to the Amazon, they're one of the world's smaller remaining rainforests, but in evolutionary terms, they're arguably the most unique. And so they're recognized by UNESCO as the second most irreplaceable World Heritage property on Earth. More than half of the world's ancient lineages of flowering plants, still existing lineages of flowering plants, live here, and we have similar figures for songbirds and other species. So this is a living museum where there are many things that grow and fly around that predate dinosaurs. So it's an incredible place, but also incredibly vulnerable. And I sit on the Wet Tropics Management Authority Scientific Advisory Committee. We've recently put out a State of the Wet Tropics report, and it makes both inspiring and spine-chillingly frightening reading, to think what is at risk as a consequence of human avarice. Of course, the challenges we face here are not restricted entirely to the climate emergency, but they are amplified dramatically by climate change. So all of the old issues that we've dealt with, soil erosion, deforestation, loss of habitat, I mean, they're all still there. The effects of these on water quality, the effect of water quality in turn on inshore coral reefs, coastal wetlands, etc. All of those issues are here and exacerbated by climate change. Climate change is very much something we're dealing with now. Last time I spoke to Alison, Deborah, and Joe, I was surrounded by floodwater. Our wet season monsoonal and cyclonic rainfall is intensifying, just as our dry spells are lengthening and our exposure to extreme heat is increasing. Now, within that context, there's been two big shifts in the way. So you can imagine, in most parts of the world, conservation in some form is an issue. Here, it's pretty much an issue on steroids because we are surrounded by two World Heritage areas, both listed for their natural values. But there's two big shifts. The first is thinking about conservation less in terms of protection of ecosystems from people, putting fences around things, controlling access, and more in terms of how we manage to build the resilience of those ecosystems in the face of climate change. For those of you who've come out of an agricultural type of background of forestry, this just sounds like common sense. Anyone who's come out of a more conservation, national parks kind of background, this is potentially horrifying, because we're talking about actively managing an ecosystem, not protecting an ecosystem. The other big shift is to think of these less as natural biodiverse ecosystems and think of them more as peopled and bioculturally diverse land and seascapes. So when we think about the wet tropics, now the reef is a baby. The reef's only been there in its current location since the last ice age. So it's not even 12,000 years old. The wet tropics rainforest goes back to the days of the Gondwana supercontinent. It's hundreds of millions of years old, except that it's also been through the most recent ice age. And people have been in this landscape for something around 55 to 85,000 years. both of these ecosystems have co-evolved with people over an extended period of time. They are cultural landscapes, but they're not landscapes just in which people have been living and making their ways and expressing them through culture itself, through culture, art, ceremony. They have evolved with those people. And so the recognizing the rights of First Nations who were here millennia before colonization, but also recognizing the influence of First Nations in the evolution, and the connections between culture, language, and biodiversity is the second important shift in the way we think about these ecosystems. Just for no other reason than to stress the uniqueness of this place, I put up an animal that for us is commonplace, but which most of you will have never seen. This is a cassowary, the world's third largest flightless bird. And in the spirit of good sociologists everywhere, the main caregivers in the cassowary world are the males. So they're more advanced than most North Queensland humanoid males. Now, by way of context, we see restoration featuring more and more over the last decade in the language of the global community, things that we sort of take for granted but probably don't dig into too much, like the 2030 agreement on sustainable development. Doesn't go hard on restoration, but it certainly mentions restoration as part of the package of sustainability. And of course, the other nice thing about the 2030 agenda was that it reinforced the centrality of people and equity and justice to sustainable development, since we all know that people tended to forget that and see it as being purely environmental. The UN declared 2021 to 2031 the decade of restoration, and they put out all sorts of social media about generation restoration. And reinforce the connections between restoration and rebuilding community. So I really like that they see a direct connection between restoring ecosystems and doing something about poverty, climate change, and mass extinction, right? So this is not a solely environment. This is certainly not a wilderness imaginary kind of a way of approaching our landscapes. The coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework negotiated through the Convention on Biological Diversity, again, comes back to restoration pretty heavily. It's about transforming society's relationship, which is nice, trying to break down that barrier, that idea that ecosystems are out there somewhere in the wilderness to be protected from people, and talks about recovery. So in a sense, this is both environmental and social recovery. They're one and the same thing. And there's some pretty ambitious goals there. 30% of degraded ecosystems should be under effective restoration. Coming back to what's for me closer to home. So a few things that I've been involved with over the last few years. With colleagues, I set up a thing called the Wet Tropics Restoration Alliance. This is a coalition of organizations that are working together to try to increase the collective impact of the work that we respectively do around ecosystem restoration. Now, let me say, like I said, generally, I think I'm not an interesting person, but for our purposes of here about talking about hope, this is relevant. So where did the idea for this thing come from? It's not my idea. I got hooked in because I was out mountain biking with some people that I knew casually, but not well, and got talking with someone who's now a close friend and colleague as we were riding up the side of a mountain through the rainforest. And we just got really excited. We got really excited realizing that we saw things much the same way, that we saw the best way to start building the resilience of the wet tropics was to work outside of protected areas and start redoubling our efforts on landscape rehabilitation around protected areas. That meant for the Management Authority, where my friend and colleague worked, a rethinking of their role. And for other organisations, it meant much more willingness to work with others and to see where we may have common interests. So it was all about scaling up what we do and about doing things in a way that would build the resilience. So we weren't just about putting trees back because farmers had overcleared or we had a local erosion problem to solve. We wanted to think about how to do it strategically to build habitat connectivity, particularly to high altitude areas that might serve as refugia during a warming climate. Unfortunately, we can't make the mountains taller, but we can make access to the existing mountains better. Getting traditional owners involved has been a really critical part of that. There's about 21 First Nations within the wet tropics bioregion, 70 roughly in the Great Barrier Reef catchment. And so making sure they're involved has been a central part of this. The Cairns Port Douglas Reef Hub was something we built with similar thinking, only this one involves more commercial operators because operating in the marine park is expensive, right? Doing stuff in the water is expensive. Owning stuff that's exposed to salt water is expensive. So marine park operators are really critical to enabling work within the marine park, including the work of all the small NGOs that are interested. And the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program is another thing altogether. So here's the declaration of interest. I receive research funding through this program, and it is huge. It's at least by public good research standards. Compared to the military-industrial complex, maybe not so huge, but it's a $100 million plus, that's Australian dollars, program involving several research organizations who are trying to find ways to massively upscale what we can do in coral reef restoration. 10 years ago, coral reef restoration was something that pretty much happened nowhere in the world. And now it's something that happens at thousands of places around the world. Many countries with large coral reef systems are low income. So the R&D that supports this is largely concentrated in Australia, in the Middle East and in North America. And we're trying to transform restoration from something that we can do at a scale of tens of square meters to something we can do at a scale of square kilometers, something more along the lines of what we can do terrestrially. The other thing that's really important here is that word adaptation. You've all seen, like, coral reefs, they're this iconic ecosystem that is at the front of every climate doom message. 1.5 degrees of warming and the IPCC says coral reefs are in serious trouble. There's a lot of assumptions in that claim, assumptions about the adaptive capacity of corals that are largely untested, but leaving that aside, we are very aware that we need to not just restore coral reefs, but consider the future climate states they'll be exposed to and consider their adaptive capacity in relation to those climate states. People everywhere involved in restoration are grappling with that question of a shifting baseline and how you adapt what you're doing to that. Now, where does hope fit into all this? Let me say, hope was never part of my thinking. Hope, it has never even occurred to me to interrogate the data we have around any of these initiatives for hope. As an individual, I got involved in these things because restoration, landscape restoration, is something I've been involved in from the earliest days of my career. Mostly in the early days in agricultural landscapes. It has always struck me as self-evidently the right thing to do. The right thing to do morally. You know, we have a responsibility to care for the planet, to care for each other. It struck me as the right thing to do socially because restoration brings people together. You know, I've known many farmers over the years who would never dream of inviting someone onto their property to work for them for free, but who will happily organise field days with all their neighbours and friends and dig holes and plant trees. I've met many people who will get involved in restoration when they won't even go to the movies because they feel so under pressure. But they'll go to their restoration group, their land care group, because they see that their mental health needs are being met by working together on something else. Look, and just intellectually, it's always been the right thing to do, you know, and economically, like out of pure self-interest. You know, we can go back to James O'Connor and the second contradiction of capitalism. Undermining the natural resource base is not in our long-term interest. So restoration for me has never been something I've done to feel good. It's never been something I hold on to for hope. It simply made sense. And I think when we think about emotion, affect, how they relate to cognition, making sense, it's not just, we shouldn't be parodying the emotional component as something just we do to feel good. There's more to it. Now, as a researcher, I got involved because similarly, this simply makes sense. We need to support restoration efforts if we're going to support social and environmental justice, particularly for First Nations people in a settler colonial context like Australia. We have to shift from protection-based to resilience-based management regimes if we're going to maintain these ecosystems. So like I said, I never went looking for hope. Hope kind of came looking for me. Amongst all the things we do, and I should apologize already to whoever volunteered to keep time, because I didn't make a note of the time I started. So please feel free to just start waving hands and interrupting at some point. Amongst the many research activities we've initiated around this agenda, we've run a national survey, 3 waves since 2019. Big surveys, you know, so all up N equals over 12,000. So everything I say from here on must be incredibly reliable, at least statistically. We give people a short description of a potential intervention that's designed to improve the resilience of the Great Barrier Reef. In principle, most of these things don't actually exist, right? Particularly genetic engineering of corals. No one's actually doing the research in Australia on genetic engineering of corals. In fact, nobody in the world knows how to genetically engineer corals. There is a small team in the US that's received some funding to figure out if it can even be done, right? So don't worry about whether these things are being done. These are hypotheticals. And we ask people, we say scientists are working on cloud brightening. And they say, you know, cloud brightening is all about reducing the amount of heat stress that corals are exposed to, provide some protection during heat wave events. Or that might be about coral seedings, which is about harvesting the larvae that coral give out in this mass spawning event once a year and concentrating it to make it settle, get it to settle on particularly degraded reefs to improve their recovery. Right? So it's a range of things to protect, restore, help adaptation. One of the first questions we then ask people is, so how do you feel about that? How does it make you feel? We don't define what feeling is. We just say, how does it make you feel? The strongest answers are around hope. In general, the strongest answers are around what you might say are positive responses, and the weakest answers are around negative responses. So people are more likely to feel happy than they are sad. Some people feel sad. I mean, they think, you know, the idea that we have to think about doing this makes me sad, and I totally get that. I sit on my board, you know, off the beach here and look up at the mountains, and there are times I feel overwhelmed by the beauty, and other times I feel overwhelmed by sadness. I get it. Generally, people feel better when we tell them that there's something that scientists are working on. Caution's also a pretty popular answer, and that's interesting, I find. Caution and hope, they both speak overtly to future expectations. So they're both telling us something about the way people anticipate futures. They've got that clear future orientation. I think to me, they say we tend to talk about these as emotions for shorthand, but I think caution and hope both speak to more than an emotional response. I think they they muddy the water a bit between affect, emotion, and cognition. And I think it's only when you allow them to muddy the water that it makes sense that people hold them simultaneously. And rather than if you treat them strictly speaking as emotions, they seem perhaps a little bit contradictory. Another thing that emerges really strongly in the survey data is relationships between hope and trust, particularly trust in science to develop solutions. And I won't say more about this now, we've published plenty on it. So, you type my name into your scholarly search engine of choice, you'll find that. Given the attacks on institutions and generally declining trust in institutions, we think it's really important to note that relationship between hope, trust, and support for climate responses. We've also done a stack of interviews, not nationally, but with people who work in and around the reef in various capacities. Maybe they're involved in NGOs doing restoration work. Maybe they're a commercial fisher. Maybe they're a First Nations person with traditional ownership rights in the reef. Maybe they're a scientist working on the reef. So semi-structured interviews around what people think the future of the reef looks like, where active restoration and adaptation fits into that. Now, people expect the future to look bleak. Right? There is no sugarcoating this, and there is no sense that being involved in restoration means people see the world as being less threatening as a consequence of climate change, right? There's no blind optimism going on here. People see the future as being very scary, and they see societal dysfunction as the cause of that, not greenhouse gas emissions. I know in the literature people argue, what's the real root cause? In physical sense, it's greenhouse gas emissions, but overwhelmingly people don't talk about greenhouse gas emissions and needing to bring those down. They bring up the politics and the economics that makes those possible. But they still talk about the possibility of change. They still talk about the possibility of an alternative. And they talk about both doing something at the societal level, but they also talk about the importance of just grassroots action. Now, I find this really interesting because in the literature around coral reefs, there's a really nasty debate going on over the potential. Maybe that's a very value-laden term. Let's say there's a very polarized debate going on around whether restoration adaptation efforts are useful, whether conversely they risk both ecological failure, they're inadequate to the size of the task, but more importantly, perhaps they risk moral hazard. They risk legitimating lack of action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Right now, people are aware of those sorts of things, and they raise those issues. We've got to be careful not to distract from the need for the societal change, but they still talk about the need for local action. They still talk about the need for doing restoration and adaptation. That grassroots respect and care is really important in their narratives. When we discuss with them the prospect of introducing new, high-tech options to scale up restoration adaptation, they don't have some sort of unleashing of overwhelming joy. It doesn't resolve it neatly. They're aware of the limits of restorative technologies, but they support developing them. They're quite pragmatic. I think it's important to have
This is your 5-minute warning.
5-minute warning. Okay, I won't take more than that. I won't even give you a standard joke about taking only 10. So people are pragmatic. They think we have to have a go. I think we've got to give it a shot, regardless of whether or not they're hopeful about the outcome of giving it a shot. They also talk a hell of a lot about spontaneous acts of care, about small scale just doing what they conceive as being the right thing. There are some people too who think that this is all an absolute waste of time, and that we're really feeding into that moral hazard. But even though this is a small group of people, sometimes I refer to them flippantly as the 6%. They're the same ones who are suspicious of vaccines, and everything else. One shouldn't be flippant, because what this illustrates is the importance of democratic dialogue around what we're doing. At no point should we be saying the climate crisis means that we must go and restore an ecosystem. The climate crisis means that we must develop a new way to go about doing it. The climate crisis doesn't mean any of those things. It's part of the context, but we still need to make decisions about the best way to work with each other, the best way to live on the planet, the best way to approach management of a particular place and time. What appears self-evidently right to me will not appear self-evidently right to another person. We're not going to resolve that by shouting at each other. So it's really important we don't push people aside because the minority view is that we shouldn't be doing restoration. You know, majority wins, let's just get on with it. We need to be having those conversations. So, you know, a few observations which I think sort of tie this a little bit back to Deborah's presentation. As I said, I didn't come at this with an interest in hope. I wasn't looking for hope either for myself. I wasn't looking for hope as a research question. But hope constantly emerges from the data. The other thing that constantly emerges is care. And you know, I guess theoretically, spent more time digging into the care literature to try and understand what it is. So just a few, you know, observations rather than a well-formed theoretical position on hope. It does strike me that while hope has a clear emotional component, that it's more than emotional. As psychologists talk about there being quite distinct differences between affect, emotion, and cognition. Affect being pre-subjective, something a little bit like a disposition, emotion being our subjective awareness of how we feel, cognition being our ability to think and rationalize. Look, I don't have a view on whether we ought to draw those distinctions for the point of view of understanding the human psyche, but I think with something like hope, we're clearly traversing those realms. There are aspects of embodied knowledge, things that just seem, that are just the way we do. But there's aspects of rationalization that run through it as well. Hence those links to science, not trust in anything, but trust in science. You know, sociologists are absolutely right that hope is collective. You know, a lot of the literature that's been written, you know, inspired by Spinoza, Deleuze, and Guattari, you know, on affect, often seems to position affect as being social, but also a little bit mysterious. I think we can work past that. The social aspect, relationships are really important in enabling hope. Yeah, Deborah stressed the embodied aspect of hope. Hope as doing is really important. And I think, you know, you pull this together. You know, hope is social practice. I can see your fingers, Joe. Don't panic. Yeah, I think we can demystify some of the theory around affect and think more about the social practices that enable hope, and by extension, that enable human and ecological agency. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stuart. I'm going to take over from you, if that's all right with everyone. Okay, I'm going to get right into it. And I have just one more thing to do before, there we go. So now you know who I am. I am going to start off taking up this idea of where we've I mean, Stuart's left us with some hope. I'm going to first talk about the other part of the collapse and then come back to the hope at the end of the presentation. And in order to be able to do this, I am actually having Rosie Braidotti accompany me through this because I find her interpretation of Deleuze and Guattari and also Haraway rather interesting in the way in which she ties together kind of this predicament of an impending catastrophe and how she's talking very much about this kind of ecological disaster and immunity breakdown and the genetic mutations and all of these other kind of ecological disasters as part of the context within which we're living right now. And she helps to bring through indeed an interpretation of hope that is very much built on the embodied and on the practice. And so what I want to do in this presentation is to start with what I work a lot on. And this is about food and agriculture, and particularly the notions of food security, food sovereignty. And this is something that I've started my career kind of thinking through these issues. And I have actually been doing quite a lot of work with the FAO on these issues themselves. And so I wanted to kind of bring us back to the beginning of when on the world stage this question of food insecurity kind of began to get global attention. And this was back in 1996 when the first World Food Summit happened in Rome, and countries around the world they saw that we were at around 800 million food insecure in the world, and they wanted to try to get us onto these first targets of getting that down to about 400 million. So quite hopeful at this point of time. And what's happened since, and this is actually one of the most striking aspects of the 2017 State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World report, is that we did have a good period of time. We did reduce food insecurity. We did actually make advances, but 2014 we started to lose that again, and it was the first time in since they started to look at these global statistics that undernourished people has been on the rise, and the estimate in this report was that we were back at 815 in 2016, which was actually more than in 1995 before the World Food Summit, right? So we've regressed. And indeed, the 2024 report's not much better. We're not going back down. We continue to go back up. We're increasing the number of people who are food insecure. And so I worked on a paper that shows that, okay, we've changed the metrics a little bit. We're measuring slightly different things. We have better data that we didn't have before, so there were probably a lot of uncounted people. But the point is that we have had, during these periods of time, a lot of persistent instability in conflict-ridden regions. We've had a lot of conflict. We have a lot of climatic phenomena in many parts of the world, economic downturns, war, drought. I mean, there's been a lot going on, and we see this reflected in these statistics about food security. And so, not because of these statistics, but kind of in light of these statistics, my co-editor, who's also on the call today, in the webinar, we had written a book about this idea that what we are seeing in all of these global level changes and And a lot of the collapse is, in a sense, this state of the world in this troublesome epoch of the Anthropocene, meaning that we are living in a planet now that has been, some say, irreparably damaged by humans and our industrial technologies. Others say there is hope. But basically, we brought together a number of scholars from RC40 to talk about kind of what we needed to understand in terms of sociologists who were not working very much on the Anthropocene at the time, but also kind of what's at the core of this Anthropocene narrative, and this idea that we need to be transitioning from these somewhat, siloed perspectives of being ecological towards looking at the entire Earth system. And in order to do that, we need to have different forms of knowledge, and we need to question kind of the institutionalization of the knowledge that has been dominating how we've gotten into this state, and going towards breaking through those binaries that still organize our societies and how we govern, particularly food systems, in this current state. And so we're very happy about this book. And we got some reviews from some dear colleagues. And in particular, Michael Bell pointed out that, in fact, the chapters in this book, they often show that despite some of these transitions and the need for change, we're not really making that much change. And particularly what we show in the book demonstrate that in a sense we're a little bit stuck in trying to propose things, and we push forward, but at the same time, we're really not moving forward so much. And so he claimed that we're depressed, and the book is clear that we're depressed about this. And so he called upon us actually to bring in more of these examples of those innovations that kind of are starting to emerge, that are around in the world, but are not being brought to light so much. And so this is what I actually want to do today, and I want to move towards the hope. And particularly thinking through the way in which Braidotti talks about hope in terms of the relationship to the future, and the fact that it's only yearning for these types of different versions of the future that can help us to actually construct livable presence. And so one of the things that is not in our first book, but is in other work that I've done, is really working with a lot of communities around the world, and particularly using participatory research to try to understand and document and draw upon these energies of different communities who are yearning for these sustainable futures. And so one of the first points that I want to talk about in terms of how hope is being found is through innovation. And I started back in 2013 and carried out about 8 to 10 now years of participatory research with multi-actor initiatives in more than 25 countries. And these actors across Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, they've been innovating to create sustainable food systems. And there's a lot of very interesting examples of this that are found in these documents. And one of the things that the sociology of innovation tries to understand is why and how these innovations emerge, and how they can generalize, how they can move beyond this the spaces where they're originally created, where the ideas first come from, and how they can create new relationships between different actors that can reinforce the values such as justice or equity or solidarity or sustainability. And so we start from this Polanyian premise that all, economic relations are necessarily embedded in the social relationships. And so those innovations that are emerging from these different parts of society, when they move to different user groups, they have to be translated. And that translation changes both the knowledge about the techniques that they're using, and it also changes the social relationships between the different groups who began to now know things differently. And so what I want to share with you today, this work that I've been doing that I started in around 2012, I've been working in a number of different places, and right now I'm currently working on a number of European projects in Italy, France, Hungary, Portugal, as well as in Africa, in Tanzania, Uganda, Morocco, Malawi, and Senegal. But I just want to talk to you about one example, because if I try to talk about all of these, we're not going to have enough time. Joe's going to start, cutting her head off at me as well. So I want to take an example of this project, just because I was just 2 weeks ago in Malawi, and I have brand new data that I've been thinking about. We've just been going through some of the things that we've been working on, and so this has been a way for us to think through this way in which hope can emerge also through participatory research. And so just a little bit of background about this of this experience. So the group that I started to work with 3 years ago, they have been working with Rachel Besner-Kerr from Cornell for about 25 years. And they started with legumes. And they started research in the early 2000s, and they started to try to link both conceptually and through causal analysis and through kind of longitudinal panel research, the linkages that can be proven between soil fertility, food security, and child nutrition. And it's based on the notion that the types of it's part of the One Health approach, but also let's say some of the microbes and dietary diversification that you can get passes through the soil, through the plants, through the bodies. And in this way, it's very much an embodied relationship that has that is linking us very truly to the land within which we are living and working and from which we're eating. And so the reason why they started with legumes was because of the forgotten knowledge that had been in this area of northern Malawi, particularly about the biodiversity hotspots for beans. And as you can see, there are many, many different beans that are grown and used and eaten in this agroecosystem. And there was an interest at that point in time to really begin to work on agroecological practices on the farm, and linking this up with the emergence of collective action at the community level to then mobilize the farmers and to change the agricultural practices. And so when I came to the project, these groups have been working together for a very long time. The very first project that Rachel had with Esther and Doc and Lizzie in this area, it was a project called Soils, Food, and Healthy Communities. And this project has since become an independent research organization that has been carrying out farmer-led research. And they have also now built a participatory teaching guide on the agroecological practices that they've been working on. And it's subsidy programs, one of the most famous subsidy programs for inputs for intensive maize production. But this is something that they have been working on. And so when I joined them, they had been working very much on the nutrition, on the farming aspects, but they didn't a bit of processing to do a bit of marketing, but they hadn't been successful in setting up kind of markets where other people could recognize the agricultural value. And so we started then, I have a hope in here again. And basically, we decided to do Rachel and Esther, they contacted me and they asked me to join them, and we started to work together to think through what it would mean to build markets and to build local markets, territorial markets for this community in northern Malawi. And so some of the work that I have been doing is related to the affect aspect of this, right? And so thinking through not just the innovations, but also the way in which we can bring the emotions, but also the effectiveness of certain types of working into these these communities. And so I had been working on some other research with colleagues that we started to think through how we can study these changes through using this futuring approaches and the participatory research. And so again, thinking through where somebody is starting, facilitating ways in which to think and envision and kind of map out where we want to be in the future. Going that process of moving from one place to the other is what we're referring to as the transition, and then really focusing on situated intermediation, where different actors who are part of the community and are sometimes joining these community initiatives. And it really depends on the situation of change within which we're working, where we are intermediating knowledge, values, infrastructures, and rules, and trying to make changes to those in order to facilitate this change and therefore move forward. So what we started to do is we started out in 4 different markets. This is what they looked like back in 3 years ago when we started, which I'm forgetting the time, but it's 2022. And I had worked on building this methodology that got published by FAO in between 2018 and 2022, where we rely upon participatory approaches at different stages of an engagement process. And so we started kind of by looking at how these markets are originally set up and what type of food is sold there, how people are engaged in that. Then we conducted focus groups with farmers to figure out also kind of how they are working, what they're working on. And you can see the farmers are quite spread out and not necessarily extremely close to the market outlets, what they're growing, and in particular, what types of questions they have for the consumers of their products. Because the farmers that have been working here, they've been selling their products to markets, to middlemen, typically not really being engaged in talking with or engaging with consumers in the markets. And so we wanted to get an understanding from them what they wanted to understand from consumers that would help them in how they're conducting their work as farmers. So we then, with that information, we created questionnaires for consumers and carried out in 2023, we carried out the first interviews inside the markets with consumers who are just purchasing normal food because there was no market for agroecology yet. And we began to kind of develop profiles of the different type of people to better understand who it is that's purchasing. And we see indeed that we have quite a lot of women who have secondary education. They're married. They have about 4 people in their household, and these are kind of the common consumers in this area. in the four markets. We also asked them particularly what they knew about agroecology at that point in time. What does it mean? What are you looking for in terms of products? And so what we found is that a lot of people actually didn't know. First of all, they hadn't heard of it. They weren't necessarily aware of it, but they were aware of the fact that um, they didn't have chemicals. So there was already a discussion about the use of chemicals, and that there was some sort of relationship between the reduced use of chemicals. We compiled our first results, we brought them together, and we conducted roundtables with producers, different intermediaries, so people working in the market, restaurants, and consumers. And we worked on trying to understand some of the challenges that we found in the questionnaires, and then also working on a work plan of what people wanted to do to kind of work through these problems. And the
Excuse
key
me,
point that,
Alison, this is your 5-minute warning.
thank you. So the key element that people wanted to work on was that they actually wanted markets where they could where consumers would know what agroecology was, and that they would be able to get different types of value out of these markets. And so last year we the partners, they created these markets with labels. You can see now that there's labels with explaining what that these are agroecology products in all of the different markets. They have captured very nice covered spaces inside the markets. And we carried out interviews last year at about 9 months after the markets were created to get a better understanding of what's going on. If we're beginning to see any changes in the way people are understanding and other aspects. The I don't know was actually not very present at all in the results, and so it means that we have indeed opened up discussions about these processes. And one of the elements that was really interesting that this woman here explained to us is that they have a lot of the difference with agroecological products is not just the kind of the nutrition aspects or the fact that it doesn't have chemicals, but there is a clear quality difference. And the day we were there was each of these markets has a clear market day, but they will also be in the markets the day before the market day, because a lot of the traders that you saw in the other pictures who are outside of these kind of covered spaces, they come into the market the day before, they purchase the best quality products, and then they resell them off in the other parts around the market. And so the biggest kind of sales that they are receiving are not necessarily on the market day, but the day before, where everybody else is coming to purchase their products because they have the higher quality. We also began to see, and this is one of the elements that we're going to look at in terms of who's cooking and who's shopping in the different households based on the different kind of income, how much they're spending per week. And again, we're beginning to see differences based on kind of this consumer profile that we have before the agroecological market. We're collecting data about dietary diversity of people inside these markets. For the moment, the difference between the aware consumers and the unaware consumers is not very high. It's not statistically significant, actually. But this is something that we're going to do in the study that we're going to do this year, this summer, in order to capture about 18 months after the markets were created. And so just to kind of close up, one of the other elements that we noted during our visits this year is that it's been a really difficult climate season. And on the left, you see a conventional a conventional plot. And on the right is the agroecological one, where they're having the crop associations with the beans and squash and other kind of medicinal plants. And this was the farmer's field. It's just on the other side of where this man is standing, who is there because his wife, she was doing something else. It's her plot, but he had to speak for her because she wasn't there when we stopped by. And what they told us is that when they planted, because everything is rain fed, when they planted the first crop of maize in the conventional field, the rains did not come after the first rain. And so this is the second planting. They lost their entire first planting and they had to replant again in the conventional field. But in the agroecological field, this is their first planting. The corn is already there. They are also gaining in resilience in terms of the climate conditions of agriculture. So basically, what I want to conclude with is kind of this going back to Latour, of course, and also this kind of these statistics that these types of initiatives that we are working on, where you have the local researchers who are working with civil society organizations to build these local food sovereignty conditions locally, who are also networked into these international initiatives, they're building hope and they're finding hope. And these initiatives are not the ones where all of the large research money is being spent on. And I think this is an important aspect for us as sociologists of science and technology in particular, to continue to make this point. These are initiatives that are brought forward without huge investments, but are indeed bringing hope and expanding from small areas and small initiatives into much larger ones because of the multi-level aspect of the networking. So I think I'll leave you with that. And I've been over my time. So I'm going to pass the floor to Jo, and she is going to provide some wonderful comments for us. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alison. Wonderful. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to see you here on Zoom. I'm Jo Lindsay. I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation. So that is here in Melbourne, Australia. I have really enjoyed listening to your presentations this morning. Thanks so much. So I'll begin with some comments on your paper, Deborah. And it was really great to have some insights from your recent book, Feeling Climate Change, How Emotions Govern Our Responses to the Climate Emergency. And you really masterfully brought together sociology of the emotions and the sociology of climate change, which are both relatively new fields, fields which took off in the 1970s and 80s. So this is all pretty new stuff, actually, when you think about sociology and the development of our discipline. And indeed, the term Anthropocene, where humans are significantly shaping the Earth's environment, was only coined in 2000. And 25 years later, it's kind of starting to sink in, I think, and that's what you are bringing to us. And I think your key argument is that feelings shape our thoughts, and I was really interested in the idea of mattering, and maybe you could talk a little more about that. But our feelings can be and have been mobilised and manipulated by marketers and politicians and the oligarchs of our time, which I'll call the tech bros for short. And emotions are used to hold the status quo in place. And so it's really thinking about how can we use emotions in the other direction and hope in the other direction, as the three presenters have discussed today. And Deborah talks about emotions and the way that they've held gender relations in place, And it made me think about, feelings of dominance behind patriarchal understandings of women's roles and capacities. And this is perhaps getting off topic for today, but thinking about the manosphere, and the kind of websites and forums promoting misogyny and opposition to feminism, that there is a kind of mobilizing of emotions to hold the status quo in place. And I thought the kind of colonial settler relation, your comments there were really excellent too. And colonialism as a kind of legitimating ideology really rang true from the perspective of Australia, where we really saw the repression of the emotional connection to land, place, and each other, and the kind of brutal nature of colonialisation in Australia.
Hello?
And
Hello?
intentionally destroying the connection to land and connection to people. So I guess my questions and my thinking that I would like you to reflect on is, how can we mobilise emotions for good and improve our relationship with each other and the planet that we live on? And Deborah argues that empathy is a powerful emotion, the ability to understand and share feelings of another. And this is something that should be kept, nurtured and expanded. And Deborah finishes with a call to action that we need to cultivate empathy through our embodied relations, our relations with our planet and with each other. And so this also prompted me to consider connections with the sociology of gender and labour and care. And it was interesting, Stuart, that you talked about the sociology of care too. And I would reflect that women are much more likely than men to care about the environment, to take action within households, which is my own area of research, to undertake sustainability labour alongside domestic labour and care. And women are also more likely to take political action about the environment too. So thinking about young women and the school strikes for climate, that's really a movement led by young women. But also grandmothers leading change in climate activism too, at least according to Environmental Health News. So how can we hold this kind of activism on the one hand against the other, where we have the US president, Donald Trump, as a retrograde version of hegemonic masculinity, promoting anger and winding back our hard-won climate agreements, and supported by the tech bros. So I think I am now getting to a question, Deborah, that you can think about. Will I talk about this first and then we can address the questions later? But how can we connect and care for each other and the planet and be progressive in an apparently regressive and more violent social world? And also the question of gender. How can boys and men be encouraged to enter the empathic realm and care for each other and the planet? So are there cracks in the system and turning points to create change? So that's something to think about. Thank you, Deborah. And now, Stuart, I have been thinking quite a bit about Constance Lever-Tracy, an Australian sociologist, and her clarion call in the 2000s for sociologists to take climate change seriously. And she published an article in 2008 in Current Sociology, the ISA journal. And she talked about the strange silence of mainstream sociology about the relationship with our warming planet. And so why had sociology been so silent? And she talked about the marginalisation of the subfields of environmental sociology and rural sociology, the subfields that we're coming from today, and perhaps the kind of focus on the urban, which sociology has taken as a reason why the sociology of climate change has been seen as a niche topic. And the other reason is that science is outside our domain as sociologists. And she talks about the macro theorists who continue to see nature as either irrelevant or socially controlled or even constructed. And perhaps that contributes to the very little discussion of global warming. So according to Leva Tracy, it's essential now that the discipline as a whole reorients itself to overcome two inhibitions that sociologists seem to have. The old one against listening seriously to what scientists say about nature, and the more recent one about thinking about the future. And so this is a bit of context for Stuart's presentation. So how much have things moved in almost 2 decades since that paper was published? And Stuart outlines that we have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and these provide a global language and a mission for justifying acting now. And we would say perhaps that it's now reasonable rather than fringe to understand the need to restore ecosystems and protect the planet by publics, but also by sociologists who study them. Environmental sociology is a growing subdiscipline, I contend. And I think that's evidenced by the growing influence of the Journal of Environmental Sociology, which was established by Stuart as the first editor-in-chief and also supported by our RC. So now to Stuart's paper. Stuart's working with scientists in the wet tropics, observing and participating in their projects, and working with communities to understand ecosystem restoration and possible futures. And he reports on the emotional responses to that, and that we are hopefully starting to feel better about taking action, or we have cautious hope, at least. But future pathways are complicated and contested. As the different storylines showed, how can we get to a transformed future, and how do we feel about that and take action is complicated. And so my question that I would like you to reflect on is, how do we go mainstream with all of this, Stuart? Or has this mainstreaming happened? How can we make the sociology of caring for the planet, climate change mitigation, adaptation and restoration more mainstream in our discipline, not just for us here? And also about reaching out across disciplines. There's kind of multidisciplinary coalitions becoming more mainstream between scientists and social scientists? And if not, how can we make it so? And how about building alliances as you did with your cycling friends? How can we make those mainstream too? Thank you very much. And then Alison, thank you so much for your presentation on finding hope in food. You also look to the future, which is exactly what we were asked to do 2 decades ago, and discuss trajectories and transitions in the food system. And the sociology of food and agriculture is perhaps a relatively small subfield in sociology, but it's about the big themes that we are addressing in this webinar. It's about our relationship with the planet, the weather and our very survival. And I really loved your legumes example of how the soil and food and health are all linked together, with that picture of the legumes being picked and eaten and moving through our bodies. I mean, we are absolutely part of the planet. It was great that you spoke about your book, co-edited with Douglas Constance, on agri-food transitions in the Anthropocene, and your efforts to change knowledge and pursue, new forms of thinking about governance and how we can pursue this change. And you then talked about over a decade of participatory research with farmers across several countries, and your example of recent research in northern Malawi. And it was a really lovely analysis of everyday practices within and alongside large-scale macro contexts. And I think it was a kind of hopeful story about innovation done well, involving grassroots change by farmers and taking communities along for the journey. And so my question would be, what can the global North learn from the global South about improving agriculture and food security? And in a time of global social and climate instability, how hopeful are you about the future of global partnerships for change and kind of coalitions between those who grow food and those who eat it? Thank you. And now on to you, Attica.
Good evening, good morning to everybody. Thanks a lot. I would like to start by thanking the organizers, and personally I enjoyed it a lot, and also I would like to say a few words about as on behalf of my colleagues from the research committee of Sociology of Agriculture and Food, RC40 for short. So we are very pleased to be here today to be a part of the very first of the ISA Research Council webinar series. So I also would like to use this also as an opportunity to briefly say a few words about RC40 as well. So since the late 1970s, we have been working to create spaces for sustained dialogue and critical engagement regarding the intensifying social and ecological problems and challenges affecting particularly agriculture and food. And we firmly believe in the importance of inter and transdisciplinary collaborations, not only for researching and addressing pressing socio-ecological agri-food issues, but maybe more importantly also for ensuring that our field, sociology, agriculture and food, or broadly speaking, critical agri-food studies, remains relevant. So, and it goes without saying that RC24 Environment and Society, Environmental Sociology, and our esteemed colleagues from this nice research collective are among the most significant collaboration partners that we have been eager to learn from and collaborate with where and when possible. So thanks again very much for this opportunity. So going towards our discussion today, frankly, when I first saw the title of the series, Our Planet and Us, Hope and Despair, the first effect, emotion, feeling, the sense that emerged was kind of, okay, so it's a little bit overwhelming and maybe a little bit ambitious. But yet after listening these three talks and Joe's comments, and with their extraordinarily nice, smooth moves of back and forth, moves going back and forth between various realms and fields like cognitive, conceptual, emotional, practical, empirical realms. So then afterwards, I couldn't think of a better title. So thank you once again for this fascinating talks. So I would like to briefly mention my take-home notes for myself to study more on them. By also as a kind of summary for all of us as a last speaker of all the three talks, brief summaries, since I cannot do, I mean, Joe did a fascinating job, so I can only add a few words on them. And then I would like to highlight three major themes that I have noted down for discussion. I mean, so I would like to address these three questions, themes, three broad themes as questions to all of us, not only to our speakers. So for Deborah's presentation, I will certainly reflect more on this formulation. We feel, therefore we think, eloquently expressed by Deborah, and on her framing how this thinking, our cognitive relations to the social world and nature is shaped by emotions and effects, and the other way around as well. So how emotions are socially constituted or socio-ecologically constituted to the extent that they can even be manipulated and weaponized, to reinforce conformity to the mainstream paradigms, narratives, governance, and so on. And maybe more importantly, their horizon regarding the very possibility and directions of socio-ecological change. And I'm particularly intrigued by the idea of cultivating empathy and hope through embodied socio-ecological practices, which I would like to hear more about it. And as for Stewart's talk, we have had the opportunity, I have had the opportunity to explore how hope and despair are narrated in relation to the restoration programs, as in the case of reef restoration. And particularly, what was particularly striking for me is the role of scientific knowledge and practice within this field, and broadly speaking, within this act of story formation or narrative formation, and reaction to scientific knowledge and practices as a constitutive figure of this feeling of this conception of hope and despair. And also it was particularly striking for me to see how these narratives can undergo significant shifts depending on various emotions and effects, as seen in as Stephen mentioned in the case of this pragmatic character of the relationship of actors to cognitive and emotional aspects. So how these pragmatism, practicality have been enacted, and with what consequences have further triggered this topic. This question has further triggered has triggered further questions. Sorry, for me, and also I have also had the chance to briefly look at the paper that one of the papers that Stewart mentioned, and I also, based on that paper, I was also quite impressed by the tension, the kind of dialectic relationship between the moral imperative to act, given this despair, and also the political social change, both as a process and as a potentiality, maybe more related to the concept of hope. So thank you for triggering these kind of thoughts, and for your stimulating talk, Stewart, once again. So as for Alison, her talk was kind of a reminder to me that this is not the first time we are going through this escalating tension or intertwined relations between hope and despair. Right? The collapse, the idea of collapse, has almost all the time been there, but Alison's talk reminded me also the significance of historicizing this our conceptions and feelings regarding hope and despair, particularly through concepts like food security, hunger, and through relations of food. And in that regard, I noted down the role and significance of different forms of knowledge and participatory research regarding this historical and contemporary analysis, which I would like to hear more about, this different forms of knowledge and its relationship to participatory research. And of course, all the relationship of all this to future making processes, which also, I guess, includes past making process. How are we reconceptualize our own past through this kind of future making processes, as in the case of agroecological practices, right? So they are mostly criticized by capitalist industrial approaches as romantic and as kind of something belong to past, but they by kind of mobilizing a very specific notion of past, they also trying to make future. So in that sense, innovation, the relationship between innovation and these alternative practices was also another highlight for me from Alison's discussion. So seeing these agroecological and alternative practices through as also innovation and the innovatory aspects. So based on this, I noted, as I said, 3 themes and questions. One is related to the concept, the very concept. I mean, these are broad themes for all of us. So it's kind of difficult to formulate specific questions for each theme, but the first is related to the conceptualization of hope and despair, the conceptual relationship between our cognitive, embodied, and emotional affective relations to the world. And I'm thinking particularly here the mainstream, in the case of food and agriculture, mainstream narrative that's also based on promotion of certain form of despair, like population is growing, demographic change are resulting in production of more meat, which further dwindles the resources. And we need to produce more and more and more. We need to double our food production by 2050, as FAO's calculations show us. So this kind of the feeling of urgency, emergency, we need to act now. So we need a transformation. This kind of conception of hope, this kind of feeling of hope is kind of different, I believe, from the kind of despair and hope that's conceptualized by alternative movements, such as agroecological movements, as Alison mentioned, or protesters singing and dancing against apartheid, and their conception of urgency, emergency, panic, and the compulsion to act right now, here and now, must be somehow different from the mainstream conceptions of despair and hope. So in that sense, how are we going to differentiate or discuss this kind of the growing tension between different forms of different conceptualizations of hope and despair, which is related to the differentiation of hope, the second theme for me, the differentiation of hope and despair, or broadly speaking, the differentiation of emotions and effects within and among socio-ecological settings and actors, like as also it's noted in our chat. So it differentiates regionally. In Iran's case, it's kind of different. In this case, so in Latin America, it's kind of different. But it also differentiates through social and ecological inequalities based on class, gender, age, etc. So I got the sense that, okay, I tend to think emotions as kind of universal things, but even the very content of emotions might change. That's the feeling that I got from these talks, might change depending on the social and ecological context. So how would you consider these differentiations and analysis of them? And the last and third one is kind of related to this methodological analytical aspect of analyzing and researching hope and despair, or emotions and effects. So I mean, I'm a student of yours, so I have who am I to talk about methodological aspects of studying despair and hope and emotions? But what would you recommend me? I mean, for instance, what was the most challenging part of studying emotions or concepts like hope and despair in the field? So what would you recommend the newcomers, students, early career researchers, your colleagues, in terms of studying these kind of issues and concepts and emotions, effects in the field, in terms of methodological terms? What would your recommendations be? I'm aware that these are kind of broad discussion topics, and I'm not expecting any specific, to the point answer to any of my questions, but I hope that these might help to stimulate, trigger some thoughts in our participants as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Atakan. So we have about 20 minutes left. We have quite a number of questions that have been posed to each of the each of the three core speakers. Do we want to give a chance to some of the people in the audience to also pose a few questions? And then maybe Deborah, Stewart, even Joe and Atakan and I, we can give some final words in response to that. Do we have anyone who's ready with a question or a comment first off? Marcus, our futures scholar.
Thank you. That was splendid, inspiring, and really brings the debate forward. I was particularly thrilled that hope was a keyword in all the three presentations. Now, just one question. Could our assumptions about hope perhaps be still too monolithic? Do we need more to emphasize the varieties of hope, the dimensions of hope, the different operations of hope? For example, concrete hope is something that might be nourished by specific practices, by a specific project, like the specific projects that Stuart and Alison referred to, or a specific pathway. But then there's also the more abstract dialectic hope, that an alternative is possible amidst all of the despair that is based on the non-determinism of future, as Walter Benjamin wrote in his Goethe book, that for the hopelessness, it is that we got hope. So as a mobilizing force, all these varieties or dimensions matter. It is essential for direct action on the ground, for social movements to pressure governments. Yet we might also need to think how hope can be channeled into the approaches by entrenched actors. So research on the more or less effective channeling of hope, I think, is also needed. After decades of climate change denialism, we see today more a kind of a technocratic channeling of hope, that geoengineering could be a savior, thus discouraging other approaches. Hence, we might want to distinguish between hope that encourages grassroots agency and hope that could stifle it. So there might be some of the looming next research questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcus. Do we have another comment or question? Do we want to go, maybe Deborah, do you want to start us off then? And we can begin to respond. And if anybody else has another question, please feel free to either type it or we're just a few people here now, so please just raise that Zoom hand and we'll give you a chance to speak. Go ahead, Deborah.
Atakan and Joe and Marcus, you both just sort of raise so much that we could, so many threads that we could potentially pull on here, and obviously we don't have time to pull on them all. So I'm just gonna be random here and just kind of bring forward a handful of the many thoughts that I have in response to some of the questions and comments that were raised. And it kind of circles back to you, Joe, and in terms of, you know, how do we move forward in a sense? Okay, so now we have this intellectual understanding of emotions and the role that they play in individual and collective action. So now what do we do? And I just want to raise one thing that is perhaps something that everybody would not necessarily be in agreement on, and that is you know, one of the most overwhelming aspects of the global climate emergency is its scale and also its abstractness, and it feels intangible, it feels overwhelming, and that very sense of overwhelm is part of the despair, right? And it just instills powerlessness. And of course, you know, as I alluded to very briefly, the social structures that we live in, of course, with that, you know, all of that pressure to individualize is also a source of powerlessness. What I would propose is the way to begin to counter that is to go local. And the way to reinstill hope, to fight that despair, is to like bring our gaze back down and to reinvest in the relationships that we have tangible and embodied connections to, right? So we can touch the soil in our own neighborhoods. We can, go for a swim in the nearby ocean. We can make face-to-face and tangible contact with the people in our communities, and that can ground us so that we are in a better position to then look up again and begin to sort of conceive once again of the global scale of the crisis that we're facing. And I would just underscore here too, I know we don't like to talk about biology and sociology, but we're talking about emotions, and emotions are about biology. And I just, I think what is important to me to remind ourselves of is that we all were born with the capacity to feel empathy, to care. We were all born with an inclination to get pissed off about injustices. You can see these behaviors in nonverbal toddlers, right? So these are things that we don't need to learn. These are things that have been unlearned, and we just need to basically recapture them again. So I'm going to stop there. I don't want to take up more of our precious time here, and I'm sure that Alison and Stuart have lots to say as well.
I'm going to be gracious and pass the mic to Stuart.
Well, thank you, Alison. So let me just pick up a couple of threads that maybe do or don't relate to each other. You raised Constance Lever-Tracy's 2008 critique of sociology for ignoring climate change, and look, Constance kicked off what's become a venerable tradition in sociology of publishing a bibliometric analysis every 3 or 4 years, showing that mainstream sociology ignores climate change. What those analyses fail to do is to recognise that other issues like violence against women and children haven't gone away, and that people ought to write about them without genuflecting to climate change. So the share of the literature that addresses climate change is, in my mind, absolutely irrelevant. And the fact that environmental sociologists and colleagues working in CogMed areas often publish in multidisciplinary journals is also irrelevant. When I publish in a journal like Biological Conservation, it's not because the British Journal of Sociology rejected me. It's because I want to reach an audience. And I can reach an audience through that journal by writing in a way that meets the needs of my colleagues and stakeholders in management agencies and in other scientific disciplines, right? These are not either or things. We still write for Sociology journal. So we really need to be careful about over-egging the problem. And I think this speaks to another issue, which Marcus's intervention highlights as well, which is avoiding creating false polemics. Polemics do not help us. Polemic dialogue is disempowering for many, many people. It's often very empowering for those who are the protagonists within the dialogue. And we see within the literature some of the polemics against restoration do a lot to advance the careers of the protagonists. They also do a lot to create despondency amongst the targets of critique. And it has been fascinating to me to observe just how deeply many of my colleagues in the natural sciences working on restoration feel the critique. It's not just an idle tear, it's a really deep anxiety-ridden response. Gender was also brought up, and this is and clearly the fields are very gendered, not always in expected ways. The coral restoration science field is very female, is very young. It's also very white. Surprisingly so, given the distribution of coral reefs around the world. So I think there's a lot there to unpack, which I won't go into now. I would say that consciously people are grappling with decolonization to a much greater extent than they're grappling with gender. And I see that impact women working in the field, practitioners as scientists, in various ways. The final point I would make, Marcus, you counterposed local action, and Deborah made a lot of very good points about getting our hands dirty. I don't like to think of local action as being somehow at the opposite end of a scale to technological intervention, because most technological intervention doesn't happen at the level of putting mirrors in space. Even solar radiation management mostly happens at the level of make different road and roof treatments and manipulations of local cloud cover and so on. What the technology does is it expands potentially, also constricts potentially, the field of practice that people have to work in. So there's interesting things there to follow up on. But in terms of getting our hands dirty, that as Deborah said, is really important for cultivating hope. It's also really important, to come back to your point, Joe, in creating those relationships. Right. If you want to create relationships with colleagues in the natural sciences, you know, writing critiques for STS journals may be effective. My suspicion, most times they're not going to be all that interested. You have to find ways of getting your hands dirty. You want to work with First Nations communities. This is something that 20 years ago, no one wanted to. They were all too scared. Nowadays, everybody wants to work with a First Nations community. And lo and behold, most First Nations community are sick of researchers approaching them. One of the Aboriginal corporations I deal with regularly, Jawabina Yalanji Aboriginal Corporation, deals with hundreds of requests every year for permission to undertake research, and is now charging people to assess their requests. It's the only way to manage it. They have to bureaucratize it just to manage the load. How do you create a relationship? You get involved in their stuff. You get your hands dirty. You go and plant trees with their group of foresters. You go to their cultural day. You get involved in their stuff. You want to get involved in community, it's easy. People always want people to come and dig holes, plant trees, carry baby corals, right? Yeah. They're not necessarily so keen on an interview.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. Can I say just a few things in response to the questions, and then I can quickly give the final last words to Atakan and Joe if they want to say something before we go, but we have just a few minutes left. So I want to say that this, because I had a lot of questions also just by listening to the other presentations. I'm not going to go into those. But the comments that have been provided already from Deborah and Stuart to the comments that and questions raised by Joe and Atakan, I mean, I fully agree with how they have responded, and also the Marcus's question. And so what I want to respond to, because I mean, I can't add anything more than what they've said, is this question that Joe asked about what can the global North learn? And I think this is actually one of the things that that I think about a lot in the type of work that I do, just because I am working with communities all across the world, both in the global North and in the global South and in the global middle. I don't know if we can say this. And so, you know, it's there's a lot actually that we can learn by working together, actually. And I think that what we often see, particularly, let's say, if we want to talk about, because I wasn't sure if the question was, what can sociologists in the global North learn from sociologists in the global South, or people in general? And I think one of the things that I see, I'm working in France, sociologists are beginning to sometimes move out of their comfort zones, but not as much as in other parts of the world. And I think that this is something that Stuart's comment and Deborah's comments are very important to take into account. The getting your hands dirty and the ability to be invited into ongoing work by communities. And that is difficult. And so oftentimes, I know, I mean, as sociologists, we will often work on topics that we have access to already, because, access to the field is very difficult. And we're not taking risks to try to gain access to some of those areas where change is happening and we're not invited. And so I think that this idea of trying to make those connections and getting invited into spaces that have not been studied, shall we say, because people don't want to be studied, or there are now reasons too many people want them to be studied, all these sorts of things. This type of approach is something that I continue to support. And so how do you do that? That comes from the long-term connections and kind of investments. And I think this returns to the point that Stuart had made in his presentation about the linkage between hope and trust. And I think that particularly in terms of research practices, the way that we carry out research, the way that we engage with different communities is not always trust building. And I think that's something that we can definitely learn in how we are teaching methods and particularly participatory research approaches to actually be trust building rather than trust destroying, which is how we lose access to communities over time. And so a lot of the work that I end up doing doesn't necessarily lead to a scientific paper every year. And I think this is something that is very important to take into consideration about the questions of time. And this is something that we can definitely learn from the types of communities that I work with. And this is perhaps this is the nature of the agriculture and food communities, but they work on different time frames than researchers do. And I think we need to adapt our expectations and the way in which we try to gain access and the amount of time it takes us to gain that access. We need to have the patience to be able to kind of continue to build those relationships, because the timelines are not the same. And I think we need to adjust our expectations to be able to maintain, and therefore to be able to study and produce good knowledge at the end of these so at the end of these studies, so that we are not exploiting, we're not kind of extracting things that are going to be of interest to us, but that we can produce knowledge that's useful to sociologists, but also useful to the communities that we're working with. Because in the end, the scientific publications are not the most important. They're important for our careers. They're not the most important things that are going to help us to keep hope for the future of a sustainable planet. So I'll leave it at that. It's at my time, it's 11:23 p.m. I think we're going to have to close this this webinar. We have a couple. We have also one question in the chat that maybe Stuart might want to write before we leave. Thank you very much, Kais, for your question. But I am going to have to close the webinar so that we can keep to our time. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for participating, and I want to also thank the presenters, The other members of the ReCo working group who have been working with me to put together this this series. We're going to have 3 more sessions this year on other topics and organized by other research committees. So I hope that you guys will come and join us for that. And thank you all to those of you who are going to be watching us on YouTube and showing us in your classrooms. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening or
Thank you
day,
so much.
if that's the
Bye.
case. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.